March 22, 1944. 2:03 a.m. Kassel, Germany. The night was silent.
We must act
Too
now.
silent, broken
Yes,
only
the
by the
situation
slow
demands it.
creaking of old timber as the wind shifted through the alleys of the Altstadt. Then came the sound, a low rolling thunder, from above too steady to be weather. Within seconds, the air cracked open. The sky didn't light up like dawn. It exploded. From the basement of the city library, 14-year-old Emil Hartmann pressed his palms against the stone wall, sweat mixing with the dust in the darkness. His mother clutched him tighter as the first rumble became a roar, and the windows upstairs shattered with the force of a tidal wave made of flame. It wasn't just bombs, it was fire that stuck to walls, leapt across streets, crawled into lungs, and screamed through oxygen itself. The sirens hadn't sounded. No warning. No time. Outside Kassel's red-tiled roofs, the pride of a medieval town erupted like matchsticks. Buildings didn't collapse, they vanished. The fire sucked them upward, twisting into a spinning tower of heat that roared like a living creature. By the time the firestorm began feeding on its own wind, entire neighborhoods were already gone. But this wasn't a mistake, it was a plan. The Reich had promised its people that the Allies couldn't strike so deep. The RAF wanted to prove they could strike deeper, and with something worse than steel. Between one boy and 1,000 bombers was only the lie that his city was safe. And in the next 20 minutes, Kassel would be erased not by enemy soldiers, but by the air itself. It didn't begin in Kassel. It began in boardrooms, bunkers, and research labs, far from the smell of ash. As Emil Hartmann and his mother trembled in the basement of their library, the storm that would consume their city had already been built in the minds of men who never set foot on German soil. The fire that would peel the sky off Kassel didn't come from rage. It came from mathematics. Across the channel, inside the cold, windowless offices of RAF Bomber Command at High Wycombe, the war was being redrawn not in trenches, but on blueprints. The new objective wasn't to cripple armies. When dropped in clusters, they created massive blast zones, opening roofs, blowing out walls, and exposing wood interiors. Then came the incendiaries, designed to ignite everything the cookie bombs revealed. Before the raid, British scientists built scale models of Kassel's Altstadt, complete with authentic German materials. RAF meteorologists chose March 22nd for one reason. They expected dry weather, low humidity, and a cold inversion layer that would trap smoke and heat low to the ground, intensifying the firestorm. The moral questions were raised quietly, cautiously, but always buried beneath one brutal logic. Precision bombing wasn't working. German production kept rising, morale hadn't cracked, and the invasion of Europe loomed. And intelligence reports confirmed what Allied planners needed to hear: few modern shelters, no significant anti-aircraft batteries, and dangerously overconfident civil defenses. They didn't just want to disable a factory. They wanted to destroy the environment the factory lived in. In secret meetings, British scientists and tacticians refined what they called area saturation firebombing. The idea was brutally elegant, rather than trying to hit precise targets with pinpoint accuracy. A tactic that had failed time and again. Under German cloud cover, the RAF would hit everything, everywhere, all at once. The key wasn't just bombs. It was fire-engineered fire. British engineers working with data from the Hamburg raids in 1943 developed a terrifying formula: drop high-explosive bombs first to blow off roofs and shatter water mains. Then, while the city lay exposed, and gasping follow with waves of incendiary bombs, thousands of them. Napalm wasn't used yet by the British. Instead, they perfected the 4-pound incendiary stick filled with thermite and magnesium. But something new was added to this raid: a monster. The 4,000-pound cookie bomb, nicknamed for its shape, was a blunt instrument of apocalyptic power. Each one was essentially a building-sized canister of high explosives. They tested fire behavior under controlled conditions, in Oxfordshire, lighting entire rows of mock buildings to watch how fire leapt from wood to tar, from paper to plaster. They noted how hot air funneled through narrow alleys, creating mini tornadoes of flame. They knew that a properly calculated firebomb raid wouldn't just burn a city, It would make the city burn itself. By the time the final plans were drawn, the numbers were chilling. The Allies needed the right to bleed, and if they couldn't bleed it from the front lines, they would burn it from behind. Every target and castle was mapped. Aerial photos were annotated by hand. A list of 200 industrial facilities, 1,000 support workshops, and 4,000 workers' homes was compiled. RAF analysts studied old insurance records, fire department layouts, even building permit data. They didn't just want to drop fire on the city. They wanted to drop it in places where it would move, where it would feed. In the days before the raid, over 500 Avro Lancaster bombers were refitted at bases in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Crews were briefed on the operation, many reacting in stunned silence, as they were told they would be releasing 2,000 tons of bombs onto a city they had never heard of. A few men asked what Castle had done to deserve this. The answer was clinical. It's efficient. There would be no leaflets, no warnings, no illusions. The plan called for a three-phase attack. 1. High explosives first to destroy roads, rupture water systems, and open buildings. 2. Incendiaries second, to set the exposed interiors ablaze. 3. Follow-up waves to spread the fire, prevent response, and prolong the burn. They calculated that with optimal ignition and sustained winds, a firestorm would form in under 15 minutes. That meant temperatures over 500 degrees Celsius, winds at 100 miles per hour, and atmospheric conditions strong enough to rip trees from the ground. Inside Castle, none of this was known. The city still clung to the belief that it was too small, too insignificant, too deep inside the Reich to be worth the Allies' attention. Citizens held blackout drills and stockpiled buckets of sand. Firefighters practiced with hand pumps and ladders. But they had trained for sparks, not for hell. And on the Allied side, the men who had built the plan watched the clocks. They didn't speak of hate. They spoke of metrics, of tonnage, of blast radius. The goal wasn't to kill. The goal was to stop the machine. But in doing so, they would kill as many civilians in 20 minutes as the Eastern Front would in a week. The tragedy wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't accidental. It was perfectly engineered. At exactly 2:03 a.m., the first Lancasters crossed into German airspace. And in the darkness beneath the stars, the fate of an entire city, its houses, its hospitals, its history had already been sealed by pencils scratching across maps thousands of miles away. The fire hadn't fallen yet, but its arrival had been guaranteed long before the first match was struck. The bombers came like ghosts. No trumpet, no siren, no time to pray. Just the low, steady growl of hundreds of Lancaster engines rolling across the cold March sky like an invisible avalanche. At 1:58 a.m., they reached Castle's outer edges. At 2:03, the first bomb bay doors opened. And everything changed. The night before had been quiet, deceptively so. A cold front had settled in over northern Hesse, clearing the skies, but thickening the lower atmosphere. From the streets below, stars seemed unnaturally bright. Children slept. Old men drank tea in basements, their radios whispering lullabies of false security. And then, in an instant, the heavens tore open. The first bombs weren't fire. They were shock. A wave of 4,000-pound high-explosive cookies dropped from 1,2,000 feet. Their impact so violent, it shattered glass 20 blocks away. Roofs lifted from their frames like paper hats. Stone walls buckled inward. Ancient churches, some untouched since the Reformation, disintegrated in the first 5 minutes. Then came the second wave. From above, Castle glowed, not with fire yet, but with potential. Wide gashes in the city's infrastructure, exposed wooden beams, paper insulation, fuel lines, and air. Everything a fire could want was now laid bare. That was the plan. That was the setup. And now the sky delivered the match. Incendiary clusters fell by the thousands. Each cluster contained dozens of thermite sticks which broke apart mid-air and scattered like seeds of destruction. When they hit, they ignited instantly. White magnesium flame at 200 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to turn bone to dust. Within seconds, Entire city blocks went from dark to daylight. But not golden daylight. A savage flickering white, then red, then black. Inside the city library basement, Emil Hartman felt the heat before he saw it. It came down the stairwell like breath, hot, dry, steady. Dust rose from the stone floor. He looked up, and for a moment, thought the ceiling itself was glowing. Then, the lights went out. Not the bulbs, the air, the oxygen itself seemed to vanish. His mother gasped. Somewhere above them, glass exploded. And then came the first scream. Outside, Castle was becoming a furnace. The flames didn't move like flames. They galloped. They leapt across streets, devoured alleyways, curled around chimneys, and surged down gutters like molten serpents. Fire climbed walls as if alive, reaching for rooftops with greedy orange hands. Within 15 minutes, individual fires began to merge, not randomly, but in patterns the RAF had calculated. And then, the firestorm began. People talk about fire as if it's a thing that burns. A firestorm is different. It breathes, it hungers. When enough of a city is on fire, the rising heat creates a vacuum at street level. Air is sucked inward from all directions, feeding the flames and turning neighborhoods into blast furnaces. Wind speeds in Kassel reached 100 miles per hour, generated not by weather, but by hell itself. Eyewitnesses later described trees bending sideways as if bowing to the inferno. People were lifted off their feet, their clothes catching fire in midair. Bricks glowed. Asphalt bubbled. Wooden doors spontaneously combusted. It wasn't a city burning. It was a city vaporizing. Emil and his mother tried to run upstairs first, then across the hall to the neighboring storage cellar. But when they opened the door, they were nearly flattened by a wall of hot air. Her hair caught fire. He beat it out with his hands, crying not from pain, but from the sound the roar. It was like being inside a tornado made of screaming. Across the city, thousands ran, and thousands more didn't. Many huddled in basements as they had been trained. But these shelters were built for shrapnel, not fire. The heat outside boiled the air inside, slowly baking the people within. Some died quietly, unconscious in minutes. Others tried to escape but found the streets transformed into rivers of flame. One woman was later found with her 2 children, all 3 reduced to blackened skeletons, still holding hands. A fireman tried to reach his post with a horse-drawn pump, only to see the horses catch fire before his eyes, their hooves melting into the cobblestones. The water mains had been destroyed in the first wave. There was no water, no pressure, just flames. The firefighters used buckets of sand, but it was like throwing dust into a volcano. A postal worker described running through the Hauptmarkt, seeing bodies already turned to ash mid-step, frozen in motion. Others described the smell, the sickly sweetness of burning flesh of wood, of old books and varnish and hair. The Fulda River, usually Kassel's quiet heart, turned monstrous. Survivors jumped into it hoping to escape the heat, but the surface was slick with burning debris. Napalm-like gobs of incendiary gel floated on the water, still burning. Those who dove deep couldn't breathe. Those who surfaced burned alive in the river they thought would save them. The RAF bombers circled once more. They dropped marker flares, making sure their target was still centered. The glow was visible from 150 miles away. Pilots reported violent turbulence at 1,000 feet, caused by the thermal column. One tail gunner glancing back saw the updraft lifting roofs and debris thousands of feet into the air, carried like toys in a demonic upwind. The bombers, despite the flames below, encountered no resistance. Germany's once feared air defenses were silent. No flak, no fighters, nothing. Because there was nothing left to defend. After just 23 minutes, the final wave passed. But the fire didn't stop. It grew. It matured. It became sentient, or so it seemed. By 3:00 a.m., the firestorm had consumed over 60% of Kassel's inner city. By dawn, it had reached 80%. It wasn't just destruction. It was disappearance. Streets vanished. Churches left no steeples. Homes left no ruins, just ash. Emil Hartman would survive, but not as the boy who went to sleep that night. His mother did not. Her last act was pulling him beneath the body of a dead librarian whose charred corpse blocked the stairwell and, by chance, sealed the fire out for another few seconds. When Emil crawled out at dawn, his shoes were gone, his skin was burned raw, and his city, the place where he played, where he knew every brick and corner, was unrecognizable. The sun rose on a wasteland of gray. A silence fell so total it was terrifying. No birds, no children. Just smoke and ruin and the occasional gust of wind that scattered ashes like snow. This was not war. This was extermination by calculation. Not soldiers fighting soldiers. Not armies clashing over borders. But a machine precise and relentless designed to turn a city into memory. And it had succeeded. By sunrise, Kassel was not a city. It was a smoldering grave. The streets no longer had names. Landmarks were gone. Whole neighborhoods had vanished, not bombed, but burned into air. The fire had done its work with such speed and fury that even memory struggled to keep up. And now, the silence. A silence thick with smoke, with the crackling of dying embers, with the hiss of steam rising from charred sewers. The firestorm had retreated like a monster, satisfied with its kill. But what it left behind was worse. A broken people stripped of tools, hope, and any illusion of safety. The civil defense system collapsed within the first 20 minutes of the bombing. The fire stations, clearly marked and mapped for targeting, had been hit in the opening wave. Their wooden ladders burned like matchsticks. The hand pumps were melted into puddles. Many of the firefighters never made it to their posts. They died in their uniforms, crushed beneath the ruins of buildings they once protected. Others who tried to fight the flames found their equipment useless. Water lines had been severed. Hoses produced nothing but steam. Sand was swallowed by flames. One surviving fireman, Peter Moritz, later wrote, "We didn't put out fires. We watched them win. The military was absent. By the time the Luftschutz Civil Air Defense Command realized what was happening, it was too late. Telephone lines were down. Radio towers had collapsed. Runners sent with messages never returned. The bunkers built to withstand artillery couldn't withstand a hurricane of fire. In the underground shelters, where thousands had gathered, panic unfolded like a slow-motion horror. These basements, cold, damp, thought to be safe, became ovens. The air was sucked out. People clawed at walls at each other, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. Babies stopped crying, then mothers stopped moving. A survivor named Helga Bauer, then just 7 years old, remembered, "I thought we were underwater. Everyone was moving slowly. No one spoke. Then someone screamed and didn't stop. That's when I knew we were dying." Elsewhere, doctors fought without tools. The few hospitals not directly bombed were overwhelmed within minutes. Burn victims poured in by the hundreds, their skin hanging from their bodies like cloth. Many arrived already unconscious, others screaming so loudly they couldn't hear the explosions still echoing in the distance. At Street Michael's clinic, a nurse named Greta Weiss worked for 36 hours straight. She later recalled, "We had no morphine after the first hour, no bandages after the second. I tore my apron into strips. The worst were the children who didn't cry. Those were the ones who were dying. The ones who screamed, we still had hope." Bodies were everywhere, on steps, in courtyards, pressed against walls, as if trying to escape through them. Entire families were found fused together, skin-melted arms locked in final embraces. In one basement, 47 people had suffocated trying to crawl out through a narrow vent. The air outside had been 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. The air inside was worse. Schools became morgues. Temples turned into triage centers. Parks filled with the dead. But the dead were not always recognizable. A civil registry clerk tasked with identifying remains broke down after 30 minutes. "They had no faces," he said. "They were just black shapes curled into themselves." How do you name that? The trauma bled into silence. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that screams inside your skull. People stopped speaking. Children walked barefoot through rubble, eyes, glassy lips cracked, not crying, not blinking. Grown men sat in the middle of streets, staring at what used to be their homes, now just outlines on the ground. One boy was found wandering with a burned doll clutched to his chest. He refused to let it go even when it fell apart in his hands. A priest who found him tried to offer food. The boy looked up and whispered, "Is this hell?" There were no orders, no organization. The Nazi propaganda machine had promised invincibility, promised the Führer would protect the homeland. But now, with Kassel reduced to ash, no one came. No speeches, no trucks, no soldiers, just silence and smoke. The psychological collapse set in as fast as the physical one. People didn't grieve. They didn't scream. They stared. They wandered. They lay down next to burned-out fountains and didn't get up. There were no rituals for this, no words, no gods left. A local psychiatrist, Dr. Emil Rausch, attempted to document the first 24 hours after the raid. His notes found after the war included a single line repeated over and over. They looked like they'd been skinned alive. But not their bodies, their minds. And beneath all this, the smoke never stopped. It didn't rise. It hung low, thick, yellow-brown, choking. It coated every lung. It carried the smell of 1,000 deaths, burnt wood, melted iron, roasted flesh. The kind of smell that never leaves your nose. The kind that stains your dreams for the rest of your life. The priests buried ashes, not bodies. The nurses washed wounds that would never close. The mothers waited for children who never came home. Emil Hartmann, crawling from the ruins of the library, saw none of his neighborhood left, just an open field of ash and silence. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He simply walked until he found a wall still standing, and leaned against it, eyes blank, the tips of his fingers burned to black. The night had come. The fire had done its job. But what it left behind was worse than destruction. It left behind survivors. And the cruel truth of Kassel's nightmare was this: the lucky ones died quickly. Those who lived, they carried the fire inside them. The fire in Kassel didn't die when the embers cooled. It migrated. It evolved. What had begun as a single night of horror was never meant to be a singular act. It was a test, a rehearsal, a blueprint. And when the smoke finally cleared over Kassel's ruins, Allied planners had their answer: fire worked better than bombs. The next step was simple: repeat, multiply, scale. The weeks that followed became a grim calendar of ash. Wuppertal, Darmstadt mines, Würzburg, Pforzheim. Each of them fell to the same doctrine: high explosives, to open the city incendiaries, to gut it firestorm, to finish the job. What happened in Kassel was no longer a tragedy. It was a system. Each new target was carefully chosen, densely built, culturally rich, poorly defended. Cities that represented not just industrial value, but the soul of a people. Planners didn't just want to cripple factories. They wanted to erase memory, to choke identity beneath fire and ruin. The bombers came at night, always at night. No warning, no resistance. Some cities tried to prepare, but how do you prepare for an air-delivered apocalypse? They reinforced cellars, filled water tanks, taught children to lie still. It didn't matter. The flames found them. The heat crushed them. The winds tore through their prayers like paper. The people began to expect the fire before it came, but even that didn't help. Because now the Americans dropped leaflets, white slips of paper drifting from the sky in the days before each raid. They listed the names of cities to be bombed next. Sometimes they arrived with chilling precision. We will come on the 25th. Be gone by then. But where could they go? Every train was packed. Every road flooded with refugees. And even if they left, they returned to rubble, if they returned at all. The leaflets meant as warnings became weapons of fear. A psychological slow burn. A promise of death on a schedule. In Dresden, families read the leaflets with trembling hands and still went to work the next day. Because what else could they do? Hope had become a luxury only the dead could afford. For those who survived Kassel like Emil Hartmann, the horror wasn't just remembering what happened. It was watching it happen again, and again, and again. Emil wandered for days after the bombing. A Red Cross worker eventually found him standing barefoot on the outskirts of the city, staring at nothing. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. When they took him to a refugee shelter, he didn't eat for 3 days. When someone tried to wash his burned hands, he bit them. By the time he was moved to a temporary camp outside Frankfurt, Kassel had already begun to fade from maps. Satellite towns absorbed the refugees. But Kassel itself, its architecture, its rhythm, its soul, was gone. It broke meaning. People stopped believing in what they were told. The regime that once promised strength and destiny now offered only silence. Hitler's voice crackled through the radio with speeches about victory, but no one listened anymore. Not when their entire block was still smoldering. Not when their daughter had been buried in a schoolyard beneath 3 feet of ash. Some turned on the party, others turned inward. But many turned away from everything they had once trusted, the Führer, the Reich, even God. Priests stood before burned altars and tried to speak, but the words felt hollow. In cities like Würzburg and Dresden, entire cathedral districts were erased in a single night. Generations of faith reduced to smoke, sacred texts turned to fluttering ash. A bishop in Mainz wrote in his journal, "If God was here last night, he left screaming." The cultural heart of Germany, its opera houses, its libraries, its medieval streets, were obliterated. Not damaged, not wounded, obliterated. The very architecture of identity was incinerated. Ancient bridges melted into the rivers they once crossed. Statues cracked, split, and crumbled. Town squares disappeared beneath a carpet of glass, brick, and bone. And with them went the stories, the songs, the family recipes, the childhood playgrounds, the sound of the old clock tower that rang every hour since 1623. Gone. Not by accident, by design. The strategy had shifted. This wasn't war as clash of armies anymore. It was industrialized erasure. The RAF and USAAF didn't need to invade block by block. They could burn the city, break the spirit, then fly home to dinner. Back in London and Washington, analysts studied the damage with cold satisfaction. Each city became a report, a percentage. Dresden, 85% destruction. Würzburg, 90%. Pforzheim, 98%. Success was measured not in battles won, but in square miles turned to soot. The world was changing, and fire was now its loudest language. For survivors like Emil, the only thing that grew was silence. He never returned to Kassel. There was nothing to return to. He spent the rest of the war in different camps, then different towns. He spoke rarely, ate little. One time, when asked by a nurse what he missed most about home, he said, "I don't remember what home smelled like anymore. I only remember the burning." That smell followed them all, a shadow memory clinging to clothing, to hair, to skin, the smell of a nation unraveling. Because that's what the campaign became, a slow, methodical unraveling of an entire people's sense of who they were. The war was no longer about winning or losing. It was about unbeing, about turning cities into dust, citizens into shadows, children into silent things. And even after the fire moved on, after the bombers flew toward the next city, and the sky turned quiet again, the real damage remained, not just in the ruins, but in the people who no longer believed in anything. Long after the flames had died, the fire still burned in memory, in conscience, in the cold calculations of history books, and in the uneasy silence between survivors and those who had sent the fire down. Kassel was rebuilt in pieces. Concrete blocks replaced charred timber. Streets were widened not for beauty, but as fire breaks. Parks were carved from the ruins of cathedrals. But the city that rose wasn't the same. It couldn't be. How do you resurrect what was not simply destroyed but intentionally erased? In the years that followed the war, Germany became a landscape of shadows, cities stitched together with glass and guilt. Kassel, Dresden, Hamburg, Würzburg, they stood again, but they carried the weight of absence, and the world, now awed by the spectacle of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, too often forgot the fire that had come before the atom. But for those who had lived through it, like Emil Hartmann, forgetting was never an option. He never returned to school, never built a family. He worked in silence, sweeping train platforms, avoiding eye contact, jumping at sirens. But in 1963, after a nervous breakdown, He began to write just fragments at first, then pages, then notebooks. His memories spilled out like ash carried by wind, a child's perspective of the inferno, a mother's final scream, the feel of fire breathing down a stairwell. When he was asked decades later why he spoke after staying silent for so long, Emile simply said, "Because if I don't tell it, someone else will, and they'll tell it wrong." And he was right, because history, when left untold by the burned, becomes a victory march for those who lit the match. In post-war debates, Allied leaders framed the bombing campaign as a necessary evil, a way to avoid a costly ground invasion, to cripple Nazi production, to force surrender. The argument was clean, logical, almost surgical. But survivors like Emile had lived through something that was not clean at all. In 1995, at a commemorative event in Kassel, an American pilot named Charles Reeves stood at the edge of a small museum exhibit, the only remaining basement wall of the old city library. He had flown over Kassel that night, releasing bombs from 1,2,000 feet. He had never looked back. Until then, he touched the scorched bricks and whispered, "God forgive us. We didn't know what we were doing." Or maybe we did, and we just didn't care. Others were less forgiving of themselves. Robert McNamara, the statistical mastermind behind the U.S. firebombing strategy, later reflected on his role in an interview that shook the conscience of a generation. "If we had lost the war, we would have been tried as war criminals. And I think that's right. We were behaving as war criminals. The difference is, we won." His words echoed far beyond the interview room. They pierced through the myths of noble air raids and surgical strikes. They asked the question no one wanted to face: does victory make terror acceptable? For decades, Kassel's survivors fought for recognition, not revenge, not reparations, but simply acknowledgement. For years, their voices were too politically inconvenient, too morally complicated. Germany was trying to heal, and America was now its ally, but the survivors persisted. In 2002, a group of citizens opened the Kassel Firestorm Archive in a modest stone building tucked behind the new city center. Inside were photographs, survivor testimonies, melted objects, burnt shoes, letters, scorched but legible, a pair of children's glasses fused into one lens, a violin, blackened but whole. No guided tours, no dramatic music, just silent space and names, thousands of names. School children began to visit. Survivors like Emile, now old and shaking, read their testimonies aloud. Not with bitterness, but with urgency. "The fire isn't over," Emile told one class. "It just wears new uniforms now. Steel and glass, missiles and drones. It still thinks it's clean, still calls itself precision, but it always ends the same children in rubble wondering what they did wrong." The legacy of the firebombing stretched beyond Germany. They influenced strategies in Korea, in Vietnam. Napalm evolved, cluster bombs improved, urban destruction became doctrine. The logic endured: break the city, break the people, win the war. But what they broke, they could never rebuild. Generations grew up among wide boulevards and sterile city centers, never knowing what once stood there, what was lost, not just in architecture, but in spirit. Stories no longer told, recipes no longer cooked, bells no longer rung. Tradition burned so thoroughly that even the silence felt scorched. And yet, from that silence, something did emerge. Not hope, but warning. Because war always begins with justifications, with numbers, with arguments about efficiency. It speaks in acronyms, in payload weight, in flight plans, until one night, fire falls from the sky, and a boy hides in a basement, and everything he is vanishes in 20 minutes of engineered heat. That is the danger. Not the fire itself, but the belief that fire is strategic, that destruction can be calculated and still be moral. Near the end of his life, Emile wrote one final message found on a wrinkled scrap of paper inside the archive's donation box. It read, "The fire didn't just burn my city. It burned the idea that we knew where the line was. We don't. We never did." His body failed weeks later, but his words didn't. They live on, etched into the memorial wall of the Kassel Archive, where visitors from around the world come to read the truth Not the sanitized version, but the version written in bone and soot. Because the true legacy of fire is not just ash, it is the question it leaves behind, and it is the same question now as it was then. Will we recognize the next fire before it starts? Because fire does not remember limits. It remembers only fuel. And as Castle proved, it does not need armies to wage war. It only needs the belief that some cities are worth less than victory, and that belief, once lit, burns everything. Fire didn't just destroy cities. It destroyed the illusion that humanity knows its own limits. The firestorms that swept through Castle were not accidents of war, nor tragic miscalculations. They were deliberate, engineered, perfected through trial and error. What happened that night when fire fell from the sky and the wind howled through stone like a predator was the result of strategy refined into an instrument of annihilation. And yet the destruction of Castle was not just physical. It was spiritual. It did not merely consume buildings or factories. It hollowed out belief. The people who crawled from the ashes were not just burned, they were stripped of certainty. Certainty in their leaders, in their faith in the idea that war had rules or that death would be fair. What emerged from that night was a silence too heavy for words and too sacred for denial. History remembers Hiroshima. It remembers Nagasaki. It remembers mushroom clouds and instant vaporization. But before the atomic age was lit, it was fire that taught us what human-made hell looks like. Castle and cities like it became testing grounds for a form of warfare so complete, so indifferent to civilian life, that morality itself seemed to disintegrate in the heat. When fire behaves like a weapon, it is not just fuel that burns, it is the line between war and crime. In the years after the war, victors wrote justifications, measured their decisions by the number of lives they claimed they saved by ending the conflict sooner. And perhaps some of that is true. Perhaps fewer soldiers died. Perhaps an invasion was avoided. But what also died in the fire was a part of our shared humanity. The belief that we could make war without losing ourselves in it. Men like McNamara would later stand before cameras and admit the truth. We were behaving as war criminals. And that statement remains one of the most damning truths of the 20th century, not just because it was spoken, but because it was never prosecuted. Because history is kinder to the winners, and silence is easier than reckoning. But silence does not heal. It delays. It festers. That is why survivors like Emil Hartmann mattered. That is why the Castle Firestorm Archive matters. Because their stories, their broken voices, and trembling hands gave names to the ash. They fought not for revenge, not to reopen wounds, but to stop forgetting. Because forgetting is how it starts again. What we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it defines who we become. If we look at the firebombing of cities as strategic brilliance without acknowledging its human cost, we learn nothing. If we talk only of victory and ignore the screaming beneath the rubble, we lie to ourselves. The children of Castle were not collateral. They were not strategic targets. They were lives full of futures that never happened, songs never sung, pages never turned. When the fire swept through their homes, it did not discriminate. It did not ask who voted for whom, who fought for which side. It simply consumed. And what it left behind was not just ash, but legacy, a scar on the face of modern warfare that still pulses beneath the surface of how we fight today. As we stand in a world still torn by conflict, with cities once again trembling under drones, missiles, and sanctioned destruction, the lesson of Castle is not history, it is warning. The weapons may change, the justifications may be dressed in new language, but the truth remains. Once you convince yourself that total destruction is acceptable in the name of a goal, the fire will not stop where you tell it to. It will burn until all the lines are gone. And so we must remember, not with pride, not with shame, but with clarity. Because the fire that destroyed Castle didn't just erase a city. It erased the illusion that we know where the limits are. And that is a fire we carry still.